You won't believe what happened when Emily Hayes uncovered the truth behind her perfect romance. Lies, deception, and a sinister secret unraveled before her eyes. What would you do if the love of your life turned out to be your worst nightmare? Welcome to our YouTube channel. Before diving into this extraordinary tale, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more intriguing stories like this. Now, let's uncover the darkest love story ever told. Chapter 1. The Perfect Beginning. Emily Hayes had always been a hopeless romantic. Raised on fairy tales and classic love stories, she longed for the kind of romance that swept heroines off their feet and left them breathless. She believed in serendipity, in love that defied all odds. A single glance across a crowded room, a moment so perfect it could only have been crafted by destiny itself. That was the love she dreamed of. And then she met Daniel Whitmore. A charming and enigmatic writer, Daniel was everything she had ever wished for, and more. Their first meeting played out like a scene from one of her favorite novels, the kind that left readers sighing wistfully. It was a rainy afternoon when she found herself wandering into an old bookstore, searching for a rare novel she had spent months trying to track down. The scent of aged paper and mahogany shelves filled the air as her fingers traced the book spines with eager anticipation. And then, finally, she saw it. A single copy, nestled between two thick, dusty tomes. But just as she reached for it, another hand landed on the book at the same time. Startled, she looked up, locking eyes with a stranger whose presence sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Daniel Whitmore. His dark eyes held an unreadable depth, like ink swirling through water. His smile was warm and inviting, disarming in its sincerity. There was an unspoken challenge in his gaze, as though he were waiting to see how she would respond. But instead of insisting on keeping the book, he let go, stepping back slightly with a half-smile. "You should have it," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the velvety lilt of someone who had spent a lifetime crafting stories with words. "I believe in letting fate decide things." Fate had decided, indeed. They spent the rest of that rainy afternoon talking over coffee in the bookstore's cozy corner. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, a symphony of shared laughter, intellectual debates, and the discovery of uncanny similarities. Favorite authors, childhood dreams, obscure movies only a handful of people had seen. It was as if they had been living parallel lives, waiting for the moment their paths would finally intertwine. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Daniel had an uncanny ability to read her thoughts, to anticipate her needs before she even voiced them. He remembered the smallest details about her favorite coffee order, the way she liked to tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the songs she hummed absent-mindedly. He showered her with gifts, thoughtful notes, and extravagant dates that made her feel like the protagonist of a grand romance novel. Late-night conversations stretched into the early hours, whispered secrets exchanged beneath the glow of candlelight. Stolen kisses in the rain left her giddy, her heart racing in a way she had never experienced before. Every moment with Daniel felt like a scene from a perfect love story, unfolding just for her. She had never felt so seen, so understood. And yet there was something else. Something she couldn't quite name. A shadow that flickered just beneath the surface, disappearing whenever she tried to focus on it. One evening, as they sat on their apartment balcony sipping wine, Daniel took her hands in his. The city lights flickered below them, casting a golden glow on his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his features. His fingers tightened around hers, his expression suddenly serious. "You're my everything," he murmured, his voice a soft caress against the night. "Promise me, no matter what happens, you'll trust me?" Emily laughed softly, tilting her head to the side. "Of course, I trust you," she said, her heart full of love. She had no idea that trust would soon be the very thing to break her. The first sign came subtly, almost too minor to notice. A misplaced object here, a forgotten conversation there. Emily brushed it off, convinced she was imagining things. But soon, small inconsistencies began piling up. Daniel would reference conversations they had never had. He would mention places she had never been, memories they had supposedly shared. When she asked him about it, he would simply smile and say, "You must have forgotten. It happens." Then there were the nights he would disappear for hours, offering no explanation. The locked drawer in his study, the way his phone screen would go dark the moment she walked into the room. Each incident, alone, was easy to dismiss. But together, they wove a pattern of unease. And yet she stayed. Because love, real love, meant trust. It meant believing in someone even when doubts crept in. It meant dismissing fears as paranoia, convincing herself that she was being irrational. But deep down, a whisper of doubt began to grow. And soon, she would have no choice but to listen. Chapter 2. The First Crack. The first cracks in their perfect relationship appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly, like hairline fractures on a pristine surface. At first, they were the kind of things she could explain away, moments of silence where there had once been conversation, texts that seemed shorter, less thoughtful. Emily had always prided herself on their connection, the way they could talk about anything for hours, from philosophy to the most mundane aspects of their day. But now, their conversations felt stilted, hollow, as though Daniel were preoccupied with something else. Something she wasn't a part of. At first, she dismissed it as stress. Work had been demanding lately, and he had always been ambitious. She wanted to be the understanding girlfriend, the supportive partner who didn't pressure him when things got tough. She told herself he'd come around, that this was temporary. And yet, deep inside, a gnawing unease had begun to take root. Then came the nights of unexplained absences. He would leave early in the morning before she was even awake and return late at night, the smell of the outside world clinging to his coat, coffee, city air, something unfamiliar. He would offer vague explanations, muttered apologies about meetings that ran long or sudden projects that needed his attention. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the distance between them was just a phase, that it would pass like a fleeting storm. But then came the moment she could not ignore. One evening, Emily returned home early from dinner with friends, her footsteps light against the hardwood floor of their apartment. She had been looking forward to a quiet evening, maybe curling up beside Daniel on the couch and coaxing him into laughter, the way she used to. But as she stepped inside, she heard his voice, low, urgent, almost pleading. "No, not yet. She doesn't know." She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The words sent a chill racing down her spine. Her heart pounded so hard, she thought he might hear it from across the apartment. She had never known Daniel to speak in hushed tones, never known him to keep secrets. And yet, here he was, whispering into the phone, as though shielding a truth from her. Her instinct screamed at her to demand an answer right then and there, but fear held her back. What if she was imagining things? What if this was all some grand misunderstanding? She hated feeling paranoid, hated the idea of turning into someone suspicious and insecure. And yet, something about the way he spoke, the tension in his voice, made her stomach twist with unease. She decided to watch him instead. Over the next few weeks, she became hyper-aware of the subtle changes in him. The way he would tense when she asked about his day, how his fingers hovered over his phone before responding to a text. The way he suddenly began keeping his phone face down on the table, as if shielding it from her view. She told herself she was reading too much into it, but deep down, she knew better. Then there were the nights when he barely slept. Some nights, she would wake to find him staring at the ceiling, his expression blank, lost in thought. Other times, he tossed and turned, murmuring under his breath as though haunted by something he couldn't voice. Once, she woke up to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, his breathing uneven. "What's wrong?" she whispered, placing a gentle hand on his back. He stiffened under her touch before turning to her with a forced smile. Nothing, love. Just a bad dream. But she wasn't convinced. Her unease deepened until she could no longer ignore it. She needed answers. She needed to know what was pulling him away from her, what had replaced the warmth in his eyes with something unreadable. And so, when Daniel left their apartment one evening, Emily made a decision that would change everything. She followed him. Keeping a safe distance, she walked through the city streets, her heart hammering with each step. Daniel moved with purpose, his pace steady, his posture rigid. He wasn't just going for a walk. He had a destination in mind. She kept close enough to see him, but far enough to remain unnoticed. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Then, he slipped into a small, dimly lit cafe. Emily hesitated across the street, peering through the window. Inside, Daniel sat at a corner table, his body angled toward a woman. A woman who was elegant, poised, and all too familiar. Evelyn Carter, his ex-fiancée. Emily felt her stomach twist into painful knots. She gripped the cold metal railing beside her, trying to steady herself. She watched as Daniel leaned in, his expression unreadable. Their hands brushed ever so slightly, the kind of touch that meant something. But it wasn't just their closeness that made Emily's blood run cold. It was the look in Daniel's eyes. The look she had once thought was reserved only for her. Time seemed to slow as she stood there, a silent observer to a reality she wasn't prepared to face. Every whispered doubt, every moment of unease, had led to this. She wanted to burst through the door, demand answers, demand an explanation that would make all of this a terrible mistake. But she couldn't move. She could only watch as the man she loved sat across from another woman, his eyes filled with something she could no longer claim as hers. Emily clenched her fists, her breath shallow and uneven. The truth was unraveling before her, and she could no longer deny it. Something was very, very wrong, and she was going to find out exactly what it was. Chapter 3. The Discovery. Emily's mind raced with questions. Why would Daniel lie about seeing Evelyn? Had they rekindled something behind her back? Or was there something far worse lurking beneath the surface? Every moment she spent trying to rationalize his behavior only led her further down a dark tunnel of doubt and fear. The man she had trusted, the man she had built a life with, was no longer someone she recognized. Determined to find the truth, Emily took matters into her own hands. She began her own quiet investigation, watching Daniel more closely, analyzing every word, every action. She started checking his pockets when he left his jackets draped over chairs, carefully going through his desk drawers when he was in the shower. The first few times she found nothing, and guilt twisted her stomach. What if she was being paranoid? What if she was overreacting? But the gnawing dread in her gut refused to subside. She had to know. One evening, when Daniel was out later than usual, Emily took her search further. She went through his office, carefully opening each drawer, her hands shaking with the weight of what she was doing. She almost gave up until she spotted a thin, dusty folder tucked beneath his desk, a place that seemed too intentional, too hidden. With trembling fingers, she pulled it out and opened it. And that's when she found it. A collection of newspaper clippings, each one detailing reports of missing women. Some were old, yellowed with time, while others were fresh, as if collected only recently. Her breath hitched as she flipped through them, her fingers growing clammy against the paper. Each woman had vanished under mysterious circumstances, their cases left unsolved. The headlines blurred before her eyes, panic swelling inside her chest. Then she saw it. A list of names written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. Each name had been carefully crossed out, except one. Emily Hayes. Her own name. Her blood turned to ice. Emily's hands shook as she read it over and over again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less horrifying. But the meaning remained the same. She wasn't imagining things. This wasn't some cruel coincidence. Daniel had been keeping tabs on these women. And now she was next. Her mind reeled as she flipped through the folder, hoping, praying, that there was some other explanation. But all she found was more horror. Photographs, receipts, scribbled notes about routines and locations. Some of the women had been in relationships. Others had merely been acquaintances of Daniel. All of them were gone, and she was the last one left. Her stomach twisted violently, bile rising in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, to flee from the apartment that had once felt like home, but now felt like a cage. Every memory she had of Daniel was suddenly cast in a sinister light. The charming, attentive man she had fallen in love with was not who she had believed him to be. He was not a devoted boyfriend. He was something else entirely. A predator. A monster. A sudden sound snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts. The front door clicked open. Daniel was home. Emily's body went rigid as the walls seemed to close in around her. Her heartbeat pounded so loudly in her ears that she thought he might hear it from across the apartment. She forced herself to move, quickly but silently returning the folder to its original hiding place. Her hands fumbled, her breath unsteady, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, to hide, to do something. She barely managed to shove the drawer shut and compose herself before his footsteps echoed down the hallway. Daniel's voice carried through the apartment, casual, warm, deceptively normal. You home?
She had to pretend.
She had to act as if she knew nothing. Taking a deep breath, she turned toward the hallway, willing herself to stay calm. She forced a smile onto her lips as he entered the room, his dark eyes sweeping over her. Hey, she said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. You're home late.
Yeah.
He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Work was brutal. You okay? She nodded quickly, too quickly. Yeah, just tired. Daniel smiled, but something about it felt different now. How had she never noticed before? The way his gaze lingered just a fraction too long. The way he always seemed to be observing her, calculating something. For the first time, she saw him not as the man she loved, but as a threat. Her heart pounded wildly against her ribs. She needed a plan. She needed to get out. But how? If she left too suddenly, he would know. If she showed fear, he would sense it. She had to be careful. She had to be smart. Her mind spun, grasping for an escape route, a reason to leave without arousing suspicion. Maybe she could fake a trip, an emergency with a friend or a family member. Maybe she could leave little by little, slipping things out of the apartment, preparing for an exit he wouldn't see coming. One thing was certain, she couldn't let him suspect that she knew. Daniel stepped closer, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture, once comforting, sent a shiver down her spine. You sure you're okay? She forced herself to meet his gaze, to hold steady, to play the part. Of course, she lied, offering a soft smile. She knew she didn't have much time. She had to get away. And she had to do it before it was too late. Chapter 4: The Escape Plan. Emily's hands trembled as she hurriedly placed the folder back in its hiding spot, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could hear the faint rustle of Daniel's movements just outside the door, the telltale jingle of his keys, the slow creak of the front door swinging open. The moment she heard the sound, a cold chill ran through her spine, stiffening her entire body. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her expression neutral as he stepped inside, flashing his usual disarming smile. Hey, love, he said, setting his keys down on the counter with a casual air. His voice was as warm as always, smooth, familiar. But now, it sent a shudder through her. She could no longer hear the affection in it. Only the hidden menace lurking beneath. Emily plastered on a smile, hoping he would notice the way her fingers clenched the book in her lap. Oh, just reading. You know how I get lost in books. He nodded slowly, removing his coat and draping it over the chair. But there was something different in his eyes tonight, an edge that hadn't been there before. He was watching her too closely, analyzing her movements, his gaze lingering for a second too long. It was in that moment that she knew. He suspected something. She had to get out.
But she had to be smart about it.
That night, while Daniel slept beside her, his breathing slow and even, Emily laid awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of her discovery sat heavily on her chest, suffocating her. She couldn't just run without a plan. If she did, he would find her. He would track her down. She knew him well enough to understand that much. So she planned. Her escape had to be calculated, precise. She couldn't afford any mistakes. Slipping out of bed as quietly as possible, she tiptoed to the closet and pulled out a backpack. Her hands were steady despite the fear gripping her heart. She stuffed it with essentials, her wallet, a change of clothes, her phone, and most importantly, the folder. The folder that held proof of what Daniel truly was. The folder that could get her killed if he found out she had it. She needed evidence. If she went to the police, she had to be certain they would believe her. If they brushed her off, she would be out of options, and worse, Daniel would know. The danger of staying was too great. Every moment in this apartment felt borrowed, like she was living on the edge of a knife. Then came the hardest part, pretending everything was normal. For 2 days, Emily forced herself to play the role of the loving girlfriend. She kissed Daniel good morning, cooked their meals, laughed at his jokes. Every word she spoke felt like a lie. Every touch made her skin crawl, but she couldn't let him see. If he suspected that she knew what he was, if he caught even the slightest hint of her fear, it would be over. She waited for the right moment, rehearsing her escape in her mind over and over again. Every time she ran through it, she found a flaw, something that could go wrong, and she adjusted her plan. But Daniel was unpredictable. He always seemed to be one step ahead, as if he could read her thoughts. The tension between them was growing. She could feel it in the air. It was suffocating. At night, she would lie in bed beside him, her body stiff with terror as he wrapped an arm around her. She had never been more aware of his strength, of how easily he could overpower her if he wanted to. The thought made her stomach turn. She knew she didn't have much time. Then the opportunity came. On the third night, Daniel received a call. Emily watched him from across the room as he answered, his expression shifting ever so slightly. She couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying, but she saw the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of frustration in his eyes. "I'll handle it," he muttered before hanging up. Emily kept her expression neutral, her fingers tightening around the mug in her hands. "What's wrong?" she asked, feigning concern. "Nothing," Daniel said, too quickly. He glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. "I need to step out for a bit. Won't be long." This was it. Her chance. She watched him leave, holding her breath until the sound of the door clicking shut echoed through the apartment. Then she moved. Heart pounding, she grabbed her backpack and slung it over her shoulders. She had already mapped out her route. She would take the stairs instead of the elevator, slip out through the side entrance, and head straight for the bus station. No cabs, no ride shares. Daniel had too many connections. If he tried to track her, she had to make sure he wouldn't find her easily. As she reached for the doorknob, a wave of panic nearly paralyzed her. What if he came back early? What if he had cameras? What if she was already too late?
No.
She couldn't afford to think like that. With one final deep breath, Emily yanked open the door and stepped out into the cold night air, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst out of her chest. She didn't look back. Not once. She had to keep moving. Because she knew that if Daniel ever caught her, she would never get another chance to run. Every step she took away from that apartment felt like a battle against time. She resisted the urge to run, to break into a sprint and put as much distance between herself and Daniel as possible. That would be too obvious. Instead, she forced herself to walk briskly, blending in with the other pedestrians. She had a plan. She had rehearsed it 100 times in her mind. But now that she was out, exposed to the open world, she realized how vulnerable she truly was. What if Daniel had someone watching? What if he had suspected her all along and had set a trap? She reached the bus station, her hands shaking as she purchased a ticket. The bus was set to leave in 10 minutes. 10 agonizing minutes where she had to sit and pretend like everything was normal, all while her body screamed at her to run. As she sat down, she took a deep breath and dared to hope. If she could just get out of the city, if she could just make it to the next stop, she might have a chance. But the fear never left her, because she knew Daniel wouldn't give up that easily. And the hunt had just begun. Chapter 5: The Confrontation. The night of her planned escape arrived. Emily lay in bed, every muscle tensed, her ears straining to catch the rhythmic sound of Daniel's breathing. Each inhale and exhale seemed deafening in the silence of the room. Her heart pounded so hard she was afraid he would hear it. The weight of the past few days pressed down on her, suffocating, but she had no choice. She had to leave. Now or never. She forced herself to count each breath, to wait for the moment when she was sure he had drifted into deep sleep. When his breathing finally settled into a slow, steady rhythm, she made her move. Moving inch by inch, she peeled back the covers and slipped her feet onto the cold floor. The apartment was dark, but she had memorized every shadow, every creaky floorboard. She had barely made it to the door when a voice cut through the darkness, freezing her in place. Going somewhere? A bolt of terror shot through her. She turned slowly, her stomach knotting as she met Daniel's gaze. He was sitting up in bed, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and knowing.
He had been expecting this.
"Emily," he murmured, his voice eerily calm as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed. "You've been distant lately. I've noticed. And now you're sneaking out in the middle of the night. Why?" Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. She willed herself to stay calm, to think quickly. I just needed some fresh air. I couldn't sleep." Daniel studied her, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stood, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps, his presence filling the room. "You know, love, lying isn't your strong suit." Every fiber of Emily's being screamed at her to run, but she knew she wouldn't make it to the door before he caught her. He was too fast, too strong. She needed to stall, to wait for an opening. "Daniel, she began, but he held up a hand, silencing her instantly. "Sho," he whispered, tilting his head slightly. "You read the folder, didn't you?" The breath left her lungs in a shuddering exhale. He knew. Panic clawed at her chest, her vision tunneling as she took an instinctive step back. He was too close, too aware. She had underestimated him. Before she could react, Daniel lunged. Emily dodged, her instincts taking over as she sprinted for the door. But he was faster. His fingers closed around her wrist, yanking her backward with an almost effortless strength. A strangled cry tore from her lips as she twisted, thrashing wildly in his grip. Adrenaline surged through her, fueling her movements as she fought to break free. "Emily, stop," he growled, tightening his hold. "Let me go," she screamed, driving her knee upward in desperation. She struck his ribs, but he barely flinched. His grip remained ironclad. Fear churned in her stomach. She needed to do more. She needed to hurt him, to make him let go. Summoning every ounce of strength, she wrenched her arm free just enough to drive her elbow into his jaw. The impact sent a sharp jolt through her arm, but it worked. Daniel stumbled, his grip loosening. The split second was all she needed. She bolted. She didn't think, didn't look back, she just ran. The apartment blurred around her as she threw herself forward, her body driven purely by survival instinct. She reached the front door, her fingers fumbling with the lock, her pulse roaring in her ears. A hand closed around her shoulder, yanking her back with brute force. Emily screamed, her body twisting wildly as she fought to break free. She kicked, scratched, did everything she could to escape, but Daniel was relentless. He slammed her against the door, his breath hot against her ear. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he hissed, his voice dripping with frustration. "Go to hell," she spat, her knees slamming into his stomach. He grunted, momentarily loosening his grip, and she seized the opportunity. She drove her fingernails into his face, clawing at his skin as she pushed away with all her might. He cursed, staggering back just enough for her to yank the door open. Cold air rushed against her as she stumbled into the hallway, her lungs burning.
She didn't stop.
She couldn't stop. She sprinted down the corridor, her bare feet slapping against the floor, her pulse hammering against her skull. Behind her, she heard him curse, heard the unmistakable sound of him following. "Emily," he bellowed, his voice filled with fury. Terror propelled her forward. She reached the stairwell and took the steps two at a time, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear him behind her, the sound of his footsteps pounding against the concrete. He was closing in. Her mind raced. She needed a way out. The front door? No. He'd catch her before she made it outside. The emergency exit? Maybe. She skidded onto the landing, spotting the red exit sign. She lunged for it, shoving the door open and bursting into the night air. The alley stretched before her, empty and shadowed. She didn't hesitate. She ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Daniel was right behind her. "You can't run from me, Emily," he shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. She pushed harder, her muscles screaming in protest. The street was just ahead. If she could make it there, if she could find someone, anyone. A hand grabbed the back of her shirt, jerking her backward with brutal force. She hit the pavement hard, her head slamming against the concrete. Stars exploded in her vision as she gasped for breath. Daniel loomed over her, his expression a mask of anger and something darker. "You should have just stayed," he muttered. Emily's vision blurred, her body screaming in pain. But she wasn't done yet. With the last of her strength, she reached for the pocket knife hidden in her backpack. Her fingers closed around the handle, and she swung. Daniel's eyes widened in shock as the blade sliced across his arm. He recoiled, cursing loudly. Blood splattered against the pavement. Emily didn't waste a second. Ignoring the pain, she scrambled to her feet and ran. This time, she didn't look back. She just ran, disappearing into the night, her only thought, escape. And Daniel's furious roar followed her into the darkness. Epilogue. The Watcher. Months passed. Emily moved to another city, changed her name, tried to rebuild her life. She dyed her hair, changed her style, avoided routine. She left no digital footprint, used cash when she could, and lived in the smallest apartment she could find. It wasn't much, but it was safe, or so she told herself. But the fear never left her. Every shadow felt like Daniel. Every knock at the door made her heart seize. Every unfamiliar number on her phone made her stomach lurch. She carried pepper spray in her pocket, memorized the nearest exits of every place she entered, and never walked home the same way twice. Some nights, she barely slept, jerking awake at the slightest noise, her breath ragged, her pulse hammering against her ribs. But as the months stretched on, the paranoia dulled. Just a little. She told herself she was safe. That he hadn't found her. That maybe, just maybe, he had given up. Then, one evening, as she locked up her bookstore shift, she felt it. A presence. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The city was full of people, always moving, always watching. But this was different. Her skin prickled, the fine hairs on her arms standing on end. Slowly, she turned, her breath hitching. Across the street, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, stood a figure. Daniel. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body froze. locked in place. He looked the same, too much the same. Like time hadn't touched him, like he had simply stepped out of the nightmare she had fled from all those months ago. He was dressed neatly, as if he had just strolled out of a meeting, but his posture was relaxed, too casual for someone who had just happened to be there. A slow, deliberate smile crept across his lips. Terror clenched her throat. This wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't stumbled upon her by chance. He had known. He had always known. She took a step back, heart hammering, her breath shallow. Her bookstore was closed, the street mostly empty. The few passers-by paid no attention to the quiet horror unfolding before them. Her fingers tightened around her keys, digging into her palm. He didn't move toward her. He didn't call out. He simply watched, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Then, as if satisfied, he turned, slipping into the night, vanishing between the buildings. Emily's blood ran cold. She stood frozen, barely breathing, the world tilting around her. Had she imagined it? Was her mind playing tricks on her? But no, the imprint of his presence was burned into her skin, her senses hyper-aware of the fact that he had been there. He had found her. She thought she had done everything right. She had erased herself, started over.
But none of it had mattered.
He had waited, watched, followed her from the shadows until the moment was right. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She forced herself to move, to turn back toward her apartment, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door and slammed it shut behind her. She slid the deadbolt into place, pressing her back against the door, willing herself to breathe. This wasn't over. It had never been over. She staggered to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street was empty now. No sign of him. But she knew better than to be relieved.
He was out there.
Waiting. She sank to the floor, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, hesitating over Lisa's number. What could she even say? That he had found her? That she needed to run again? That she was so tired of running? She clenched the phone in her fist, dread curling in her stomach. Then she heard it. A soft knock at the door. Her breath stilled. She stared at the door, her body paralyzed. Knock. Knock. It was gentle, almost polite. But Emily knew better. She swallowed a sob, her vision swimming. Her fingers hovered over the lock, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Then came the whisper. Emily, her name, spoken so softly it barely carried through the door, but she heard it. She knew that voice. The same voice that had haunted her nightmares. The same voice that had promised she would never escape. Tears slid down her cheeks as she pressed her hands against her mouth, willing herself not to make a sound. Another knock. Then silence. Minutes passed. An eternity. Finally, she gathered the courage to look through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She backed away from the door, her entire body trembling. She should call someone, Lisa, the police, anyone. But her mind was too fogged with fear to think straight. Instead, she slid to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, rocking slightly as she tried to breathe. Daniel was here, and he wasn't going to stop. She wasn't safe.
Not now.
Not ever. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to come.